Hello and welcome to our first week on the theme of embracing change for Awakened. Change? Change? Change can be scary sometimes, can it? Especially if you find yourself in a religious community. Churches can be terrified of change, even something as simple as swapping out the type of coffee you're using or changing up the paint color. It can be scary for churches to the point that they often refuse to change anything until they just pack up and die. Change. This is kind of ironic, though, because Jesus' entire message is about transformation. The whole purpose of Jesus' teachings is about changing, transforming, renewing our life and our world. I think Jesus' teachings are not meant to be teachings that we can just get right the first time. It doesn't happen right out of the gate. Jesus' teachings have to be practiced. I don't think that we're naturally inclined to love our enemy. I don't think we're naturally inclined to forgive. I don't think we're naturally inclined to want to work for systemic justice, even if that comes at personal expense. Jesus' message is a message that involves transformation. We're not going to get it right the first time. We're not always going to get it right. We're going to mess up, but the practice of implementing Jesus' teachings is what transforms us and transforms our world. Paul recognized this when he talked about renewing the mind, renewing ourselves, and practicing a faith that transforms us, even in ways sometimes that make people say, why? Why do you want to practice a faith like that calls you even to love your enemies? And I think the answer is because doing so ends up counterintuitively being incredibly life-giving. Because if you're willing to forgive, if you're willing to love even your enemies, it keeps you from that negative energy of hatred and of bitterness and resentment, because that stuff eats away at our souls. It is like acid for our faith and for our well-being. If we want to thrive, if we want our world to thrive, it comes through implementing the teachings of Jesus that are ultimately life-giving. Change can be scary, and it's not always good, but transformation from the gospel is something that is absolutely life-giving. Faith communities ought to be willing to try new things. We in our lives ought to be willing to try new things as well. Not saying that everything's going to work out perfectly, that everything's going to stick, but it is by trying that we experience life in new ways, that we can experience faith in new ways. And ultimately, we may even find more expansive life, more expansive faith. Transformation is absolutely possible. You know, I had a professor in my doctoral program who talked about church leadership being like jazz, but I think faith is like this too. He said that churches have to be willing to try new things, that they have to see their ministry like jazz. And in jazz, you know your primary melody. You know what's carrying you through. That's like your mission, vision, core values as a church. It's like your faith that Jesus has taught you as a Christian. But in jazz, you go off and you improvise a bit. You try new things, you experiment. And if it works, you might jam on it for a while. And if it doesn't, you come right back to the main melody. I think that's true in churches, because churches need to try new programs, they need to try new ministries, they need to be willing to try to think about finances in new ways and all of that. They need to be willing to improvise knowing who they are at their center. I think it's also true for us as Christians that we ought to know who we are. We ought to know Jesus' primary teachings about love, compassion, but the way that we implement those, the way that we experience God, that we ought to be willing to try some new things. We ought to be willing to try new ways to serve. We ought to be willing to try new ways to worship. We ought to be willing to try to experience God in different ways because that can ultimately expand our faith. In this section on embracing change, the spiritual practices that we are engaging in involve trying some new things. And so this week, I encourage you to try something new, but something specific. I want you to try, as you're able, to help someone in a different way. Try a new way of helping someone. Maybe that is acknowledging someone who's living on the street, striking up a conversation in a safe way. Perhaps it's volunteering at a food bank. Perhaps it is helping a friend in need, someone who needs help moving, some way that isn't how you typically help someone. Think about expanding how you might help someone. One of the most concrete examples that I can think of when I helped someone in a new way was when I began working for this outdoor church whenever I was in seminary. And I started spending a lot of times with people who were experiencing homelessness. And I began to develop real relationships with people who had radically different life experiences than I had had. And those relationships really began to build and to flower. And I was living in Connecticut at the time, and I would go to the part of town where a lot of these folks lived during the week, and I knew them by name, and they knew me by name. And I wasn't solving their problem. I didn't have a way to get them housed or to stop addiction or to treat mental illness. I, of course, tried to help them connect with services as I could, but what I could do was build a relationship. And that benefited both of us because we both had experiences to share. There was friendship and commonality there. Encountering people in new ways, helping people in ways that are outside of your comfort zone can be incredibly life-giving. In a safe way, of course, but it can be incredibly life-giving to help people in ways that are safe, that stretch you. So this week, think about a way that you could help someone in a way that you haven't tried before. I hope it's life-giving for you. May it be so, and thanks be to God. Amen.